Discussion around the Atlantic slave trade can at times be one-sided, and understandably so. In attempts to countervail the popular narrative, some individuals from within and outside of our community highlight the existence of slavery in Africa. Though true, the topic is seldom engaged in a meaningful way. What were the similarities and/or differences between these institutions within Africa and America? Today, we're going to explore the nature of slavery in Africa. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and contributing to this content. The link to Patreon is in the description box below. Also, stay tuned with a word from my sponsors.
Have you ever wanted to learn an African language? If so, keep watching. There are many ways to connect to different African cultures. Many do it through the enjoyment of the music, the dancing, and my personal favorite, the food. But when it comes to learning the languages, that can be a bit challenging. So here we are. We here at Speak Afrique are trying to lay the groundwork to build that bridge with our new short phrases and vocabulary series. These are the seed projects to something much larger that we're building. We currently have languages such as Twi, Kikongo, Mandinka, Igbo, and many more will be added as time goes on. So, if you want to start your journey to connecting to Mama Africa, head over to Speak Afrique at iTunes or Amazon and let's start learning together. Ngiyabonga. Salami kahle.
To begin, I believe all or most people around the world today would agree that the enslavement of human beings is wrong. Though that's a position I hold myself, when observing the past, I try to withhold judgment. In doing so, my intent is not to make light of slavery in America or Africa, nor is it to paint any people as the proverbial bad guys. History is complicated, and I hope this video reflects that. Moreover, the main goal of this video is to advance, as close as possible, a proper historical perspective. In this video, comparisons will be made between slavery in America and slavery within Africa. In that way, the topic will be elucidated, increasing the likelihood of meaningful discussion. Covering all of Africa is beyond the scope of this video, so our focus will be the nature of slavery primarily in West and Central Africa, with some references to the Western Sahara region as well. Let's begin. Africa is not a monolith. In fact, it's one of, if not the most diverse continent on the planet. Africans have varying cultures, languages, religions, and worldviews. Thus, the institution of slavery within the continent naturally expressed itself in diverse ways. Based on my research, there seems to be two principal differences between slavery in America and slavery in West and Central Africa. The first difference is what I'll call the hierarchical slave model. In West and Central Africa, there were different classes of enslaved groups, many of whom capable of acquiring varying levels of freedom or lifestyles. This didn't seem to be the case in America, where the everyday life of the enslaved individual, for the most part, remained ossified. The second difference is the more critical one. The acquisition of power of enslaved individuals throughout West and Central Africa was virtually unheard of in America. Some of the similarities between the two seem to be the presence of agricultural or domestic labor, reports of dehumanization or abuse, and the illegal enslavement or re-enslavement of individuals deemed free. Admittedly, the differences between the two institutions demonstrate the more salient observation, and in my opinion, deserves more attention. Hopefully you'll understand why. The West and Central African peoples and civilizations we'll be covering are going to be the Mali, Songhai, and Oyo states, the Igbo peoples of Nigeria, and the peoples of Congo. Interestingly enough, I noticed a pattern when it came to the institution of slavery in all of these regions. The pattern is the hierarchical slave model mentioned previously. All these groups of Africans had classes of enslaved peoples that consisted of three categories: the royal or court slave, the military or conscripted slave, and the agricultural or domestic slave, all of whom had very different lifestyles. Among the earliest documented mentions of enslaved peoples in Western Africa date to the 7th century. By the 11th century, slave trading had matured, and West African states such as Ghana, Tekrur, and Sila were frequently acquiring enslaved individuals from further south and selling them northwards across the Sahara. These enslaved individuals made their way into the Moorish armies of North Africa as conscripted soldiers, concubines, and domestic workers. The Almoravid leader of Morocco, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, acquired enslaved black men as soldiers to aid in the conquering of southern Spain. In this year, the might of the Emir Yusuf increased. He bought a body of black slaves and sent them to Al-Andalus. Interestingly enough, there were several Moroccan rulers who were children of enslaved black women or concubines, the most famous perhaps being Sultan Moulay Ismail. His favorite wife and queen of the palace was a former enslaved black woman herself named Zaidan. Apparently, there was no issue in Moroccan society for the Sultan to be born of an enslaved black woman. A similar occurrence would be hard to imagine in American society. Military or conscripted slaves like those in Morocco existed all throughout West and Central Africa. In the Congo region, they were known as Mbare, and control over the Mbare was a critical issue for Queen Nzinga in her engagement with the Portuguese. In the Oyo Empire of the Yoruba peoples, conscripted soldiers were a central feature of the cavalry, which was the backbone of their power. One of the critical differences between slavery in America and slavery in West and Central Africa was the possibility of acquiring power, even over free people. Enslaved individuals could express considerable autonomy and power based on the status of their master. This was the top 1% of enslaved individuals in the hierarchical slave model. They were known as royal or court slaves. Scholar Michael Gomez gives a great distillation on the matter. In speaking about the institution of slavery within the empires of Mali and Songhai, this is what he has to say. As the extension of the master's power and authority, the enslaved was simultaneously vessel and receptacle, a subject often in command of others, whether free, royal, or otherwise. The enslaved were the insignia of the slaveholder's rank, with the potential of operating at a similar level of influence. Rather than a contradiction, there was alignment between a slave's status as personal property and his or her elevation as agent. In this way, human bondage was a model for religion itself, reflecting submission as the means to extraordinary achievement. In my opinion, this is the quintessential difference between American slavery and West and Central African slavery. For example, the African ruler of the Songhai Empire, Askia Dawood, had an enslaved individual named Mesakul Allah. Mesakul controlled a plantation operated by agricultural slaves for the production of rice. His control of the plantation made him quite wealthy. Askia Dawood himself even commented on it. Did I not tell you that this slave had become so sated with wealth that he had no equal except for us and our children? The Songhai ruler seemed to almost joke about how ridiculously wealthy his slave had become, and Mesakul was certainly not the only enslaved man who owned large plantations in the Songhai Empire. Now, granted, royal slaves were like the LeBron Jameses of the world, the top 1%, but in general, it was possible for enslaved people to own other enslaved people themselves, and even wield considerable political and military power within the empires of Mali and Songhai. Moving further south, scholar John Thornton tells us about the court slaves of Congo called Ijiko. Slave officials managed affairs at court and formed the elite and officer corps of the royal army. Moreover, they placed the Ijiko as judicial and military supervisors over the territorial nobles. Thus, reducing their power while ensuring the collection of taxes. There was a similar system in the Yoruba Empire of Oyo. There seemed to be 3 different classes of royal or court slaves in Oyo: the eunuchs, the Ilari, and the Ejeli. The eunuchs looked after the king's wives and children and were involved with judicial, religious, and administrative matters. The Ilari served as the king's bodyguards, royal messengers, and tax collectors. Interestingly enough, there were several hundred of them of both sexes. The Ejeli were provincial slave officials appointed to administer specific towns and reported directly to the king. So as we can see, the question of slavery in West and Central Africa is a highly stratified topic. Now, though the image portrayed seems charitable, we can't say that dehumanizing elements did not occur. Though the following quote is in reference to the Gold Coast, it can be applied to all of West and Central Africa. Enslaved persons generally suffer deprivation and indignities, especially as new captives. Slavery in West and Central Africa was no innocuous thing. Life as a concubine was certainly not rosy. As a conscripted soldier, you were undoubtedly disposable. Strenuous labor on Sahelian plantations may have led to low life expectancy, and you and your kin could be tied to the land indefinitely. The lifestyle of royal slaves can be an exception, yet we can't presume lack of harm. 2 Yoruba proverbs give us some insight behind some of the more dehumanizing aspects of slavery within a particular region of Nigeria. A slave is not a senseless block of wood. When a slave dies, his or her mother hears nothing of it. But when a freeborn child dies, there is lamentation, though the slave was once a child in his mother's house. Scurrying around does not ensure prosperity. Working like slaves yields no benefit. The first proverb highlights family separation and the devaluing of human life, similar to American slavery. The second proverb is interpreted to mean that people should not work themselves to death like a slave would, suggesting that the overworking of an enslaved individual was not uncommon. These Yoruba proverbs likely apply to the life of the average enslaved individual. One fascinating bird's-eye view regarding the differences between American slavery and slavery in West Africa was demonstrated by Olada Ikwano, a former enslaved Igbo child who became a writer and abolitionist later in life. He speaks directly to the differences between slavery in Igbo land, Nigeria, and slavery in the Caribbean. In regards to the enslaved individuals of the Igbo people, he says, "With us, they do no more work than other members of the community, even their master. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly the same as theirs, except that they were not permitted to eat with those who were free-born, and there was scarce any other difference between them than a superior degree of importance which the head of a family possesses in our state, and that authority which as such he exercises over every part of his household. Some of these slaves have even slaves under them as their own property and for their own use." Scholar Paul Lovejoy tentatively accepts his testimony. He highlights that Ikwano was only 10 or 11 when he was captured, so his understanding of an enslaved person's workload and lifestyle may not have been completely understood. Regardless, the testimony exists, yet again establishing the complex reality of slavery in West and Central Africa. Scholar Michael Gomez tells us that we must understand slavery in its local and temporal context, and scholar Kwabweni Bohan seems to agree. Slavery must be understood in a wide range of cultural contexts due to its variety and form observed throughout numerous African societies. Africa is not a monolith, yet the institution of slavery throughout West and Central Africa seems to have had similar themes: the existence of the royal, military, and agricultural slave, as I've called it, the hierarchical slave model. Though there are some similarities between American slavery and the slavery that persisted in West and Central Africa, it would be difficult to dismiss the glaring differences between the two with absolute narratives such as, well, slavery is slavery. In America, slavery and power were unassailably distinct. In West and Central Africa, this distinction was less clear. Well, I'm all out, guys. I'm hoping you got a better picture regarding the nature of slavery in Africa and understand the complexity behind it. Keep in mind, this video just applies to West and Central Africa. Eastern, Northern, and Southern Africa may be completely different. Let me know in the comments section below if you would like to learn more about those regions. And if you like these videos and want to help in its continued production, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.